From other episodes, we know that the whole idea of encryption means to take some kind of algorithm that stirs up our clear text and using a key then creates a ciphertext. And in order to decrypt it, we take that ciphertext, run it through the exact same algorithm, backwards, sort of, using the same key, and it comes out as clear text. What's important here is that we're using the same key to encrypt and decrypt, and that's what we call symmetric key algorithms. So any type of cryptography where you use the same key to encrypt and decrypt is going to be a symmetric key algorithm. Okay, now when we're dealing with symmetric keys, we have to actually start encrypting stuff. So traditionally, let's use an example. Let's say I have a Microsoft Word document. This Microsoft Word document could be, I don't know, it's a big document, all right? So it's like half a megabyte big. Well, I don't encrypt the entire thing in one shot. What I do is I use blocks. So a block is a chunk of data that we take this block, we do the encryption, and then we move it over. Then we take another chunk. You get the idea? So when we're talking about algorithms that use a symmetric key and do it one chunk at a time, those are symmetric block algorithms. Symmetric block algorithms are the cornerstone of the internet. Every time you open a web page, you're using some form of symmetric block algorithm. Every time you log into at least an encrypted wireless network, you're using some kind of symmetric block algorithm. It's all over the place, and if you want to understand cryptography, my friend, you need to understand symmetric block algorithms. So let's go ahead and go through some of the more famous symmetric block algorithms that have around over the years. The first one I want to start off with is called Data Encryption Standard, or DES, or if you're hip, DES. DES dates back like from the 1970s. But even though it's an old algorithm, it's still used out there, not too much anymore, but it's still out there. And it's a really great way to understand how wildly complicated symmetric block algorithms can be. So what I want to do is take you through a trip of actually going through the process of doing encryption using DES. Now remember, there's more algorithms we're going to talk about in a minute, but right now, just watch this wildly hairy process of DES in action. The first step of DES encryption is to grab a 64-bit chunk of plain text from the data stream we wish to encrypt. We perform what's known as an initial permutation, a very specific stirring of the data. Okay. Let's go ahead, now that we've done the initial permutation, and set the data aside for a moment, and let's look at the key. So here's our key. Now the first thing we're going to do is drop the last 8 bits off the key. We now split that key into two 28-bit chunks. We then grab the first 24 bits from each half and put them together, and we've created what's known as a subkey, which is 48 bits. Cool. All right, now let's get back to our data. We're going to perform what's known as a Feistel function. It works kind of like this. We're going to take the 64 bits and split it into two 32-bit halves. We then set one of the halves aside, and we're only going to work on this one right here. So we're going to expand this half into a 48-bit chunk of data using an expansion function. We're then going to apply an XOR function to this using the subkey we've already generated. Next, we're going to use what are called S-boxes. In DES, X boxes take in 64 bits and output 4 bits. There are 8 different S boxes, and each one gives a different 4-bit output. So we apply the 8 S boxes to the data, creating a 32-bit output. And then we're going to do what we call a final permutation. We then put the two 32-bit chunks back together, but backwards. And that completes a single Feistel function. Wow! And that is basically how DES works. Now keep in mind, this is a little bit simplified. I've cut some spaces out because mainly I would bore you to tears if I showed you every step. But what I want to get into your brain is the idea that DES, even though it's an ancient and kind of obsolete symmetric block encryption, it's incredibly complicated. In fact, as the years progressed, they get even more complicated. So we begin to see, for example, DES was good, but even by the 1990s, it was becoming obvious that DES was going to be hackable. Yeah, I know, with all the complexity, there's pretty smart people to figure out a way to break that encryption. So we began to see other types of symmetric block encryptions with names like Blowfish and Triple DES. The thing that I want to talk about here is that when we're talking about symmetric block algorithms, there's certain things that we always keep in mind. Number one is the key length. In general, the longer the key, the harder it is to crack. Number two is the block size. How big is each chunk we're taking that we go ahead and do the encryption on a per chunk basis? In general, the larger the block, the faster the encryption takes place. And then the third thing is the number of rounds. So once we take this block and we start stirring it up, how many times do we go through this stir? Again, the number of rounds is usually a pretty good clue as to how robust the encryption is. So let's go through Blowfish and Triple DES compared to DES, looking at key length, block size, and number of rounds. Okay, so let's go ahead and put DES in. We know DES is a block cipher. Now, it uses a 64-bit block size. It runs 16 rounds with a key size of 56 bits. I know we say 64, but we take 8 bits off for overhead, so it's really 56 bits. Now, Triple DES was also a block encryption, also with a 64-bit block size. It also had 16 rounds, but basically what it did is it repeated the DES process 3 times. So you had 3 56-bit keys. So in essence, you had a 168-bit key. Blowfish had a 64-bit block size. It ran 16 rounds, and the key size was variable. It could be as low as 32 bits and as high as 448 bits. DES, Blowfish, and then Triple DES did a pretty good job of taking care of our symmetric block encryption needs going through and pretty much until around the year 2000 or thereabouts. What was happening is that as computers became more and more sophisticated, bad guys were getting better at cracking more and more sophisticated different types of block encryptions. So the National Institute of Standards here in the USA created a competition, although it really wasn't a competition. It was more like a conference where you had all these private sector and public sector academians and all these people getting together to come up with a new type of harder to crack symmetric block encryption. This competition, it's not like it went on for a couple of days. It went on for a long time, and they started off with hundreds of different submissions of a new, faster, unhackable block encryption. And it's interesting because even though they did call it a competition, in a lot of ways, these different competing teams would work together because, somebody had this and then somebody had that, and they would work together. So from hundreds, they got it down to like 24, then they get it down to about 5, and then basically they put it to a vote because the last 5 were all very, very good, and a particular type of algorithm called Rindahl ended up being the winner, and they put it together into a form of encryption called Advanced Encryption Standard, or AES. AES is about 20 years old now, but it is so good, it is, knock on wood, still completely unhackable. And if you're going to be, anytime you go to a web page, an encrypted web page, you're going to be using AES. You don't know that, but you are. And it is wonderfully powerful. It is great stuff. If you're going to be using advanced wireless networks, you're going to be using AES. That's what they use. It's great stuff. Now, the challenge to AES is, well, nothing. It works great. In fact, for the exam, about the only thing I want us to do real quick is let's go ahead and take a look at key and block size and all that information, just as we did with Blowfish, DES, and Triple DES. So, AES, obviously this is a block algorithm. It has a block size of 128 bits. Now let's jump over to the key size, because you can have 3 different key sizes. You can have 128, 192, or 256-bit keys. Basically, the bigger the key, the more secure you are. And now going back to rounds, we would have either 10, 12, or 14 rounds, depending on whether you had 128, 192, or 256-bit key sizes. So basically, if you're going to be seeing a symmetric block encryption in today's day and age, it's going to be AES. It is pretty much everywhere. There's a reason it's everywhere. It's because it's fantastic. However, there is an alternative to block ciphers. There's another type of cipher that's very rarely used anymore, but it's important that people understand it. And it's called a streaming cipher. A streaming cipher, almost imagine like a sausage machine where you're putting in a big bunch of data and it's coming out one bit at a time, and you use the algorithm to determine if this is a 1 or a 0. So a 1 pops out, based on the algorithm, this time it'll be, keep it as a 1. This time it'll be a 0. Get the idea? Streaming algorithms encrypt 1 bit at a time. Streaming algorithms, unlike block algorithms, were very popular in things like wireless networking, would be a great example. So streaming ciphers have been out for a long time. Traditionally, they were faster than block ciphers, but today, block ciphers have become so fast, in particular AES, that streaming ciphers are pretty much ignored. In fact, there's only one real streaming cipher you may ever run into, and that's known as RC4. Let's go ahead and take a quick peek at the numbers behind RC4. So, RC4 is a streaming type of encryption. It really doesn't use block sizes, it's 1 bit at a time, and because it only gets to see that bit once, there's only 1 round when you're using that streaming encryption. And the key size, and this is often the case, if you don't have a lot of rounds, you often want to use really big keys. So the key size can be as small as 40 bits and can go up to 2048 bits. I find all these different types of encryption algorithms absolutely fascinating. The big takeaway I want you to have is don't panic about all this stuff. If you see anything on the exam, it's going to ask very simple questions like block size or something like that, and we've gone through all those in this episode in detail. The last thing I want to mention is you don't pick these algorithms. These algorithms are incorporated into more advanced streaming or block protocols that call to these things. Like, for example, if you're going to be on a wireless network, you're probably going to have encryption. And there's a number of different encryptions. There is an encryption called WPA. And if anybody has a wireless access point and you access it, you can see it in there. If you use WPA for your encryption, you're going to be using RC4. If you set it up for WPA2, you're going to be using AES. That's really all there is to it. So you don't pick AES or triple DES. You pick some other thing higher, and it's gone ahead and it's chosen for you. So it makes life pretty easy. Just make sure you're doing your encryptions whenever you can.